Thank you for joining us, everybody, for another National Museum of Computing talk. It's my pleasure this evening to have with us Mary Monro, who will be talking about Dora Metcalf. Now, of course, today, in our day and age, we're very used to the subject, the idea of entrepreneurs and women working in technology, and even women entrepreneurs. People such as friend to the museum itself, Dame Stephanie Shirley, who's very well known. Dora Metcalf, though, however, was technology's or the IT industry's first woman entrepreneur. And when we talk about computing services, which was the area which she specialized in, we probably think of the giants, the companies like IBM, founded in 1916, as we know it, the CTR company, Computing Tabulation Recording Company. That was June 16th, 1916. But in those early days of computing, women dominated early computation and calculation, but further up, the higher up these early companies, technology companies, you went, obviously men seem to dominate. Some things don't really change too much, I guess. Dora, however, her story is rather interesting. She was inspired by her early experiences of calculation and computation, and by the time she was 24, she founded a computing services company, as one which I described to you when I started talking, and she became pretty successful. She ended up running some major contracts, and she became a millionaire by the time she was in her 40s. And such was her experience, she even landed a position at the company that would manufacture the Turing-Welchman Bombe, which many of you who are involved with the museum will know about. And for those who don't, it's the device that was developed by Alan Turing and Gordon Welchman, and it was used to decipher and help decode the German military's encrypted communications using the Enigma device during the Second World War. For all of her brilliance and her fame and pioneering, though, Dora's not really that well known about. And as you know, she's been lost in the mist of time. And somebody who's made it her mission to bring Dora's story to light is Mary, who's not just an author, but she's also Dora's great niece. Mary's been writing Dora's story through a blog and through other sources, and she's been doing a lot of research for the National Archive, and she's been working through original materials such as Dora's diary. So Mary's going to be talking to us about her life and her challenges and all the things we don't know about her. Without further ado, over to you, Mary. Take it away.
Thank you very much. That's a very kind and comprehensive introduction. So, yes, I'm going to tell you the story of Dora Metcalf this evening, who was born Dora Green. And I want to tell you what she achieved, but I also want to explain to you how she achieved it, because as has been alluded to, it's pretty unusual to find a woman tech entrepreneur in those days. And I think it's interesting to try and understand how she did that, and that might have some relevance for some of us today. So I just want to start with her very early life. So Dora was born in India to Irish parents. Her father worked for the colonial service, and I guess like many, he succumbed to cholera when Dora was just 8 years old, and that obliged the family to come back. Actually, they didn't go back to Ireland. They decided to come to England. And I think this was her mother's decision, appreciating that her children would really need to have a good education to make their way in life. They weren't a wealthy family. They needed to succeed on their own merit. And Dora studied at Bedford High School. And the image on the right is taken from the school's history. And you can see that right from the 1880s, Bedford High School was sending girls to university, mostly to London and Oxford and Cambridge, including some Cambridge mathematicians there. And one of the things that you will see over and over again in Dora's story is that she was kind of planted in fertile soil, if you like. She was put in an environment where academic excellence was expected, where it was normal for girls to go to university. And that was exceptionally unusual at that time. In 1900, for example, only about 20,000 young people went to university at all, and only 4,000 of them were women. So she was in a pretty small minority of girls that were being educated with that aim in mind. She gained her BA in mathematics via an external degree from London University. by which I mean that she was able to study from school. She never actually went to London to study, and she gained her degree at the age of 19. Now, again, London was a pioneer, not just in women's education, but in distance learning. So this idea of an external degree was a pretty new idea at the time. Now, she continued to move into another sort of fertile soil, if you like, at Allenswood Academy, where she was following a pretty traditional path here in terms of becoming a teacher. And Allenswood was a kind of elite school for young ladies, and alumni included people like the Strachey girls and Eleanor Roosevelt, people like that. But it wasn't just a sort of fancy finishing school. It was actually a very progressive school, and again aimed at academic excellence. Just also to say, Dora, as well as the environment being important to her for her career, her family was very important to her, and she was a lifelong carer for her deaf sister, Hilary. Now, at the outbreak of World War I in 1914, Dora gave up teaching, and she met and fell in love with this handsome chap, Hugh Cass, and they became engaged when he left for the front. Sadly, Hugh was killed at Gallipoli in 1915, and with him went Dora's perhaps expected future as a wife and a mother. And of course, she was not alone in that experience. She was one of the so-called 2 million surplus women. And these women were vilified, they were frowned upon, they were in some cases deported. It was as though they were somehow blamed for the slaughter of their loved ones. And it left many of them in a very difficult state, both emotionally and economically. And Dora, perhaps because of this heartbreak and knowing that there was little opportunity to find somebody to fill Hugh's shoes, threw herself into work, and she applied her mathematical skills to comptometers, working in munitions factories in London, training other women how to use these comptometers, and meanwhile dodging Zeppelin raids along the way. So this is a comptometer. I think there is one at the National Museum. This particular one's a Model F. It's a sort of large desk-sized object, and quite ergonomically designed, actually, for right-handed people. Not so good for lefties like myself. And the comptometer was basically a mechanical abacus, and it was part of an office mechanization revolution, along with typewriters and telephones. And all of these office machines were very much regarded as women's work, and women were often siloed off into the typing pool or the telephone room or the machine room. They were not really seen as being part of the business or part of the important aspect of what was going on in any particular office. So while women might have thought that this was a great opportunity to develop their world of work, and it was certainly better than a factory and perhaps better than working in a shop maybe, but it held no opportunity for career progression. Remember, there was the marriage bar as well, which would have prevented any hope of career progression or a pension or anything, or even moving up the career ladder at all. However, this is in World War I, and perhaps that was a better time than any for a woman to start a business. The men were away at war. This comptometer thing was very much seen as women's work. Maybe that was a good time for Dora to try becoming a businesswoman. And she moved to Belfast, and she lodged there with this gentleman, Sir George Clark, who had founded the Workman Clark shipyard in Belfast when he was just 19. So he would have been a great mentor, a great supporter, and he helped her to get comptometers into not just his shipyard, but also into Harland and Wolff. And when it was suggested that she might actually set up in business and start selling comptometers, he would have given her a good shove and say, yeah, you can absolutely do this, girl. And I think it was really Dora's combination of her mathematical skills. She saw what these comptometers were capable of, and she saw how they might be used by businesses and by government departments. And she had this real vision of their possibility. And as you can see, she also had this elite social circle that she was part of, starting off with Sir George Clarke, who was one of the big wheels in Belfast. And in fact, she set up an office in Belfast in 1916, and she set up an office in Dublin in 1917. And in Dublin, she lodged with this lady, Matilda Knowles, who was a renowned botanist. And her flat was the meeting place for the whole revolutionary set. Remember, this is just after the Easter Rising that was in 1916. And Matilda's flat was where politicians of every stripe would meet. It was also where writers and artists and people like Willie Yeats, for example, would meet. And it's also where Dora met some revolutionary and very radical women doctors, Dr. Kathleen Lynn and Dr. Catherine Maguire, who would go on to found a hospital called St. Ultan's. And we're going to come back to St. Ultan's Hospital a bit later on. But again, this is more fertile soil. There's endless possibility. There's endless opportunity. Just go for it. But Ireland at the time was a pretty tricky place to be. And so Dora actually came back to England in 1919. And for the British agent for the comptometer machines, she did a survey of UK government departments who were thinking of not buying any more comptometers and just sort of recycling the ones that they'd had during the war. But Dora's survey, and I suspect her conversation with the various managers there, led to the biggest order of comptometers in the country's history, in the company's history, 200 comptometers. And this strengthened her resolve, I think. And she went back to Belfast in 1923. And at that time, the Troubles were still raging, and they had caused the 1921 census to be delayed. And she wanted to win that census contract when it got rearranged in sort of 1925, 1926. But she was canny enough to realise that she wasn't going to be able to win it on her own as a single woman running a small business. She needed male collaborators, both on the tech side and the political side. So she buddied up with a friend of hers called Sam Horton, who she'd met at Matilda's flat in Dublin. He came from the same village as Matilda. He was a Belfast businessman, and most importantly, perhaps, he was an Orangeman and a unionist, which meant that he lived in the corridors of power and knew everybody who was anybody in Northern Ireland. She also teamed up with her cousin, Everard Green, and he was the co-founder of BTM, British Tabulating Machines. And so their first big contract had been the UK census of 1911. So he had the technology and he could supply the tabulators. And this was a great way of setting up in business with the supporters that she needed. And then the final piece of the jigsaw was her old friend, Sir George Clarke, who by this time was a senator in the Northern Ireland government, and I dare say he helped them to win the contract. So this is one of the punch cards from the Northern Ireland census of 1926, and this was the first time that the data processing had been done mechanically at the rapid rate of 24,000 cards per hour. And the registrar, I hilariously named Mr. Bullwinkle, recorded that all the card punching had been carried out by just 7 young women and a supervisor between October 1926 and April 1927, which was lightning fast in those days. So that was a fantastic success, a fantastic way of getting started in business. And remember that at this stage, mechanical calculation was really just a straight swap for calculation by hand by these armies of clerks that they were. So the census is a good example of that. All of that would have just been done by hand. But Dora had the mathematical skills to see beyond that, to see the possibilities for business. And she also had the technology in the sense that these tabulators that her cousin was supplying were great at totting up huge quantities of data, but they could only add up. Whereas the comptometers, which were capable of all mathematical functions, provided you've got a statistics table book, etc., meant that they could be used for doing all sorts of kind of project management and business planning and control tasks. So Dora had some pretty big contracts right from the get-go. She'd already been working with Harland and Wolff since 1918. She had contracts with the Great Southern Railways in Ireland, and she also had contract with the Shannon hydroelectric scheme, which is shown in the bottom photograph. In other words, she was doing fine business both sides of the Irish border, which is fairly remarkable. But her business really went international and really started making a lot of money when she won the contract for the Irish Hospitals Sweepstake. So just to orientate you to these pictures, on the left is the first Doyle. And I've circled two men there. In the second row is Joe McGrath, who was the founder of the Irish Hospital Sweepstake. And in the back row is Robert Barton, who was one of the signatories to the Free State Treaty. And he was also a cousin-in-law of Dora's. So her favourite cousin was a girl called Nora, and Nora was married to Robert Barton's brother. So I suspect that Dora had met Joe McGrath. She had worked with him on the Shannon hydroelectric scheme. The picture on the right shows the Irish Hospital Sweepstake draw, and it was a big event. It was a bit like the lottery show used to be, only bigger. It was a big national event, and these women are not nurses. They are women in nurses' uniforms, which is advertising for you. So Dora had an in with this new scheme, which followed the passing of the Sweepstake Act in 1930. And she was remarkable, really, in being able to work with somebody like Joe McGrath, because not only was he a staunch Republican when she was an Anglo-Irish Protestant, effectively, but he had a pretty dodgy past. He'd been in prison after the after the Easter Rising. He had murdered and tortured and done bank robberies, and you name it. He was head of intelligence for the IRA. But as far as she was concerned, this was business. The business was legal. She was doing the sort of auditing and the processing for the sweepstake, and that was all above board, and she was able to do that. She really had learned to take a neutral stance. And that business went on from 1930 right through to the 1950s, in fact, and made a fortune. And it also led to her meeting the Pope in 1933. Now, Dora moved to London in 1932, and again, she planted herself in fertile soil. She joined something called the Women's Provisional Club, and this was a club for the eminent women of the day. It had been founded in 1924 by some fairly elite women, one who was a director of an advertising agency, and Viscountess Rhondda, who also had all the political connections. And I think Dora probably became a member in 1932, but the Women's Provisional Club archive has been lost. It should be in the Women's Library, but it's not at the moment. I'm trying to track it down. And just as a biographical detail, Dora married in 1935, and we will meet her husband in due course. Now, the Women's Provisional Club was a meeting place for eminent women in politics, in the professions, in the arts, in industry. So this was a source of inspiration, a source of support. They would have weekly or bi-weekly or fortnightly meetings, usually over dinner or lunch. And I bet they had a great laugh and a chat and supported each other. But also, it was a canny place for making business contacts. You know, these women had fingers in pies all over the place. In 1934, Dora founded the Service Bureaux Division at British Tabulating Machine. So right from the early days of her business, right from 1924, she had been working closely with her cousin Everard Green and with BTM, and was effectively their agent in Ireland, although that relationship wasn't formalised until somewhat later. But in 1934, she formally joined BTM, and this was really on the back of the sweepstake business, because it was making so much money, and most of the tickets were actually sold in the UK rather than in Ireland, and so she needed regional offices for all of that. And so it seemed sensible for her to join BTM formally as part of their staff, especially now that she was in London. And I don't think they were terribly welcoming. I think they were welcoming of the profit that she brought, but they were all about the technology. They were all about the hardware. They were really interested in developing bigger, better, faster machines. And I don't think they were interested in what they regarded as being small business stuff or services. But this is where Dora's skill really was in seeing the opportunity for services. And actually, you know, when you think about it, that idea about statistical analyses, market research, scientific technical services, well, firstly, the tabulators in those days couldn't do it. You had to have the comptometers for that. But that was what was stimulating some of the development in computers that would come in with the electronic computing revolution post-war, the demand to be able to do that, which the first electronic computers were built for the scientific market rather than for the commercial market. But Dora is already doing this in the commercial market, but she also had a team of mathematicians working with her in her division to service the market research and the scientific and the technical market. But she was also busy developing the science of business planning and control, and there was a lot of work for local government, various, you know, the health departments and the tax departments and so on and so forth. And at the bottom of the page here is a sort of typical edition of the Tabulator, which was the BTM in-house magazine. This one's from March 1938, and gives there's this article about the kind of work that the Service Bureau Division were doing. And I guess if this is being recorded, or I can provide the slides afterwards as well, if anybody's actually interested in reading the article, that will be a possibility. I just wanted to show you this slide as well. This is typical of women in computing in the 1930s. So this is the Tabulator from July 1937, and it's a picture of women at Unilever. And this is the Hollerith section of the Mechanical Services Department. This is not part of the business. This is not integral. This is the Mechanical Services Department. And you can see they're all young women. This is, again, when we've still got the marriage bar in place, and they're siloed off into their little machine room, and they're not really taking part in the business of Unilever Limited. Now, I just wanted to emphasize as well that Dora had these government contracts, you know, right from the very beginning, right from that time post First World War, when she did that survey of government departments, which included, you know, the Admiralty and Customs and Excise and what have you. She had contacts in government, central government, as well as local government, right from the very beginning. And she made good use of that in the 1930s when she was now running the Service Bureaux Division at BTM. And again, the picture on the left is a typical set of cards for, in this case, the Public Health Department in Glasgow. And I've just blown up a little bit of the information there because it's just so extraordinary, the kind of things that they were recording about children in those days. Cleanliness of the head, dirty, nits, or verminous. Lovely. Now we get to the Second World War, and as Gavin said at the beginning, BTM were the company that built the bomb machines, and these were based obviously on the Turing-Welchman design, but also based on Harold Keane, who was the chief engineer at BTM, on his rolling total tabulating machine that he had launched, that BTM had launched in 1935. Now, the first bomb, named Victory, arrived at Bletchley Park in 1940, and 211 bombs were made in total. I am not going to give you a history of the bomb machines because you already know that, I guess. But demand rose rapidly, and this is what I'm alluding to is the challenge that it represented for BTM to meet the demand for these machines at Bletchley. And also, not just the machines, but the operators. So for each bomb, you would need roughly 10 women operators to cope with 3 8-hour shifts and a downshift, and 2 operators per bomb. So there's a lot of staff, as well as the hardware. And I just want to kind of explain what it was like from BTM's point of view, rather than from the sort of Bletchley point of view that we tend to think about. So this is just a little extract from a letter from the BTM chairman to Admiral Dowling, saying, "All we can say is that the work is of vital national importance, a parrot phrase which everyone uses when they want anything, and consequently impresses nobody." And this indicates some of the frustration that they were experiencing. And I've just sort of split out into the different areas, the challenges that BTM faced. So at a business level, they were sacrificing huge business opportunities to transfer their ordinary Hollerith work and work for the Ministry of Aircraft Production over to the Cantab machines. And bearing in mind that they weren't allowed to apply for patents or design protection. So they were they had to hand over a huge proportion of their business to this government demand, which would obviously come to a complete halt at the end of the war. So it was not going to be ongoing business. And all of the design and engineering development that they made during that time would have to be scrapped because they couldn't patent it. From the point of view of the factory, obviously space was an issue, and they had to build new areas of factory in order to be able to build the number of machines that the Admiralty were asking for. They couldn't always get the tools that they needed to supply the factory and enough space to build the things. And also, there were frequent alterations in the design specifications. So it wasn't just a question of setting up and getting everybody going. There were quite often another change in design and another change in design that they were having to cope with. It was extremely difficult to get the parts that they needed. So everyone was competing for materials. If you think of all of the tanks and the ships and the aircraft and the goodness knows what else that was being built, that all needed iron and steel and wiring and all these fairly ordinary basic raw materials. But also they are having great difficulty getting hold of things like specialist parts like high-speed relays or plugs or what have you. And although in theory they were being given absolute top priority for these supplies, that information didn't always reach down the chain of command to the people who were actually providing them. So it was a great challenge to actually build the machines at all. From a labour point of view, obviously everybody in the factory had to sign the Official Secrets Act, and they were losing staff all the time to call up. So during the war, 477 of the factory workers, and not just the workers, but also some of the directors, were called up and were taken away to war. So they were very short of enough people to actually build these bomb machines. And it was a question of getting sufficient skilled and unskilled labour. And I believe, there was a letter on the 27th of June 1942 saying that they needed 300 women and 65 men for the factory, and where on earth were they going to find these people? They also had to introduce a 7-day working week, which was a novelty in those days, and a headache for the personnel department. And logistically, of course, as well, all of these people, so they had a massive increase in the number of staff. They needed accommodation, they needed to be fed, they needed to be able to get from their accommodation to the factory 7 days a week. They needed telephone lines, they needed heating and ventilation. It was a massive, massive project for them. So the question is, what did Dora do in all of that? Now, she was the head of the Service Bureaux Division, and Bletchley Park was known internally at BTM as Bureau B. Dora had the government ministry contacts and the business contacts in potential suppliers. She had the recruitment experience, particularly of female staff. And since well before the war, she had had a dedicated government office that was secure. She was also, as we've seen with her Irish experience, she had the discretion and the diplomacy and the ability to keep her mouth shut. That was essential. And she was also an extremely determined lady and wouldn't take no for an answer, which, given that they were up against other ministries wanting to take these supplies when BTM needed them, she would have needed to have been pretty fierce, I think, to get her way. Now, from the National Archives material that I was able to find, I know that on the government side, the key players were people like Commander Saunders and Commander Travis at Bletchley Park, and underneath them, dealing specifically with BTM, were Gordon Welshman, who was the biggest supporter and fan, effectively, and a chap called McLaren at the Admiralty in Bath, who was responsible for the BTM contract, and another chap called Fletcher, who was his assistant, I think. And then within BTM, the chairman, as we saw on the previous slide, got involved, Raleigh Philpotts. G.H. Bailey was the technical director, and he sort of headed up the contract team. And Harold Keane, the chief engineer, was absolutely integral to the whole thing, and very much he and Welshman, I think, spent a lot of time together. And then within BTM, there were also the operational managers, Mr. Waters, the works manager, and so on. But this needed a project manager. This needed somebody to pull it all together. This needed somebody to manage that whole contract and make it happen. You saw from the previous slide the number of moving parts involved in this. So whilst I don't have cast iron documentary evidence of what Dora exactly did, this is my best estimate that she was involved in this contract. And it caused her an immense amount of stress. And she had been intermittently unwell with a duodenal ulcer for the previous 10 or more years, in fact. And this came to a fore at the end of 1942. And I think at this point she ducked out of the Bureau B contract. So let's just try and understand the kind of things that she was up against. Firstly, in 1940, her home and her office were destroyed in the London Blitz, so she'd had to move out, and she moved up to northwest London to be closer to, to be outside of central London and to be on the train line up to Letchworth. And actually also she was very close to Stanmore there. The pictures on the right is Commander John Metcalf, whom she'd married in 1935, and Howard Green, her brother, my grandfather. Now, both of them had fought in the First World War, and both of them went off to war and were away most of the time through the Second World War. They knew what the dangers were. She knew what the dangers were. She'd lost her fiancé in the First War. I think she feared losing these two loves in the Second War. Her business partner, Sam Horton, was also away at war. So she was left very short-handed with her businesses in Ireland that she was still running, and she must have been very fearful for the lives of her loved ones. She had to try and keep those Irish businesses going, as well as this immensely stressful workload that she was dealing with in London. So this duodenal ulcer started to get the better of her. She had a gastrectomy operation in December 1942, and she was off work altogether until March 1943. And Everard Green, her cousin, I think, persuaded her that she needed to really cut right back on her workload, and that she should just manage the London dividend services aspect of the BTM business, which is a pretty major demotion from what she had been doing. Meanwhile, in 1943, her husband went off to command an aircraft carrier, and she wouldn't see him again for many months. And her beloved sister, the deaf sister Hilary, died in October 1943 on the anniversary of their mother's death. So that must have been a huge blow as well. John ended up wounded, and his father died. Her brother Howard, she barely heard from, but he was very much involved in the Italy campaign, and she saw from the London Gazette that he'd earned the DSO and the CBE, and you don't earn those by standing at the back. And then John was away for over a year at the end of the war. So she was having a pretty tough time, not just work-wise, but with what was going on in her life. And I think this really led to a sort of collapse of confidence. And you would not have forgiven her. You would have forgiven her rather for giving up at that point. But she didn't. You remember right back at the beginning with her friend Matilda Knowles in Dublin, and meeting the Irish women doctors there, Dr. Kathleen Lynn and Catherine Maguire. So they reappear on the scene in 1949, and Dora did all of the statistical analysis for the BCG campaign. And to prove that she was keeping up with the times, she also sold the first electronic computer into Ireland to the Irish Sugar Company in 1957. And that was an HEC 1201 machine at that stage, which had all of 20 bytes of memory, 800 calculations a second. And I just wanted to name check Gordon Clark, who was the first computing engineer in Ireland and a member of Dora's team, and a woman called Christine Willies, who was a mathematician, who wrote the first program for Irish Sugar. So there's a little bit of Irish computing history for you there. But Dora did eventually retire in 1962, and she retired to the wilds of the West Highlands of Scotland. They were a lifelong fishing fans, the pair of them, and so they chose to retire up there. But this house is 7 miles from the nearest road. It has no electricity, it had no running water, and it was only accessible by boat. But the thing that interests me about it is that this house, Swordlands, had been used as a training centre for the Special Ops Executive during World War II. And I, try as I might, I cannot find out what Dora's connection was with that house and why she ended up there. But that's a little intriguing mystery to leave with you. And so I just wanted to conclude by saying, well, what's Dora's legacy then after this remarkable career? And unfortunately, I think her legacy got obscured by that shift that took place in the 1960s and 1970s, where computing came out of the machine room and into business and started to be seen as a career option for men, and women tended to then get edged out of it. And also there was a shift in industry focus on computers as data processors, that the race was on then really for reducing cost and increasing speed, rather than computers as mathematical instruments, which is really how Dora had seen them. She'd seen them as ways of helping business management and control, rather than as data processors. But my hope is that her contribution will now be better recognised. And if you want to find out more about her, you can have a look at the website dorapower.co.uk, where there's a lot more background and history on all of this. Okay, thank you very much.
That was great. Thanks, Mary. That's an amazing story. And she really has quite an incredible life. It's amazing to think of all that going on in a time that's now she started out over a century ago. And we think of those big, slow functioning machines from our era of fast processing and hyperdense computing and these big old machines. I was fascinated by you said, I think when she calculated the Northern Ireland census, it took, I think I missed the exact date, but it took about a year to do it. I think it was seven people. Was that correct?
7 months it was, yeah.
7 months to crunch that data. Yeah. And that was fast by that time. So I definitely got some questions. Hopefully we soon. I'll just kick off with one. I was curious about her transitions to BTM, and you noted at the start there that they were not terribly welcoming of her. I guess they were all hardware heads and they couldn't get their idea around services. Why did they bring her over?
Well, money, I think, is the short answer. She was making an immense amount of money out of this Irish hospital sweepstake contract, and BTM were getting a share of that because they were selling her the punch cards for doing the actual processing, and also they were getting a percentage, I think, of the fee, or if not a percentage, then certainly some sort of commission for using the machines for doing the processing. So, their profits and what have you were going up massively just by this one apparently little contract from Ireland. And I think they thought, I imagine they probably thought they'd make more money out of it if they brought her, in-house effectively.
And I think when we chatted about this earlier, I think he mentioned she never received the job title which she deserved. Is that correct?
No, anyone else, she would have been director. But I think they called her, I don't know, head of division or something like that. They didn't give her a title as such. And so she was never a director, never a main board director, never given that kind of recognition. And I've looked through the Tabulator, the in-house sort of customer magazine, and all of the pictures of women are none of the women are named, and usually they're group shots of people kind of working away at a computer. Whereas the men are usually portrait shots, they're named, they're usually the directors, and they're usually showing VIPs around the factory or something like that. None of the women get that kind of recognition.
Do you think she didn't get the job title? Did she fit in really at BTM? Can we draw that conclusion, or was she kind of tolerated? Was there? She was just tolerated because of the business?
Yeah, I don't think there was any kind of personal animosity or anything like that. I think it was just that kind of unconscious sexism, really, that was just typical of the time. I just don't think. I think she might have said, "I should be director," because she was not, she's not a shrinking violet. But they probably would have just said, "Oh well, no, I can't can't possibly think of doing that. We'll set up this division and you can run it, but we're not going to make you a director. But it's very difficult to tell that. I haven't got any documentary evidence for that.
Remarkable, considering it was her cousin, I think he said, founded BTM, wasn't it?
It was her cousin, yeah. And I think he was a terrific supporter, and I don't think he saw her in that way. I think he saw her potential and admired her, and was probably a great help to her at BTM. I imagine he probably smoothed things over a lot on her behalf, but that was just one person.
Great, that's really good. Do we have any other questions? I don't want to take up all the time here, but if you've got another question, please unmute yourself or pop your hand up.
I've got a question.
Okay.
Yes,
Mary, the research for this looks absolutely incredible, what you've done. What was the main source of it? I'm guessing the Tabulator magazine must have been particularly helpful.
Yeah, so ICL have an archive which is held at the Science Museum. And actually the Science Museum archive happens to be in Wroughton in Wiltshire, and I was living in Bath, so Wroughton was actually pretty handy for me to get to. And so I did all of this, pre-lockdown, obviously. And the Tabulator magazine and the Tabacus magazine, which was the kind of staff magazine, were a source of great information. But it's interesting, things like the Second World War period, the Tabulator magazine after that said, we want to give our appreciation to all of our workers who worked so bravely during the Second World War, and Harold Keane was awarded an OBE for his services. At no point does it say what they actually did. No. So that was impossible. And then the National Archives, I found a lot of correspondence between Gordon Welchman and probably Admiral Dowling and Travis and what have you. And there was a lot of communication as well between both the chairman and the managing director of BTM. But it was all to do with the kind of very top level contract staff, please, from BTM side saying, please, can you help us to get these supplies? Because we keep being told that we're top priority and we keep not being able to get what we need. Can you please sort it out at the relevant level? That sort of thing. Or here's our invoice. That was another quite a frequent communication. But again, really very, very difficult to work out exactly who was doing what. And those top level contacts, were just for dealing with top level issues. It doesn't really tell you about the day-to-day running of the contract or how they manage that. But just from looking at what they said they were needing and how they were, things like the accommodation for the extra staff and things like that, you think, I guess, when you think about it, how on earth did they manage to do that? It's a massive logistical task.
Yeah. Well, one final question, a quick one. How many times in this period have you wished you'd had a couple of days to talk to her about it before she passed?
Well, Andy, you're older than me and you spent more time with her than I did. So why didn't you ask her?
She was a little old lady who gave me a nice postal order for my birthday every year and Christmas, and with a beautiful house in Scotland. That was it. Yeah.
It's so frustrating. Have only known her when she was so elderly and when we were kids and didn't really think to ask. It's frustrating.
Well, it's wonderful.
I mean, you have to remember that she would have signed the Official Secrets Act, and she would have been still bound by that, and then some, when she died in 1982. So even if we had asked her, what did you do in the war, Granny, kind of thing, she would not have been able to say. No.
Anyway, that was amazing. Thank you so much for that, Mary. I enjoyed that. It's wonderful. Well done.
Okay. I'm just seeing a question. Was Dora related to Graham Greene? No. Short answer to that one.
Okay, thank you. I was about to ask that one on behalf of Naomi, I think, but thank you for taking that. And then we had another question. Can you see this from Peter C? did Dora supply the punch card kit for Block C at Bletchley and Drayton Parslow as well as the bombs? Do we know that level of technical information?
No, no, I don't know. I mean, that kind of level of activity was probably done by somebody like the works manager or something like that. The supplier of punch cards kind of thing. So I don't know is the short answer. But I mean, remember that as well as the bombs at Bletchley, there were actually numerous tabulators. So numerous of the ordinary BTM kit. There was a whole department in Hut 11, I think, with Frederick Freeborn, who was seconded there with a number of other staff that were doing the, ordinary calculation stuff, nothing to do with the code breaking. So they effectively had kind of two contracts at Bletchley.
Where have you? I mean, to question you, are there any other sources you haven't tried yet to get more of this information? Where do we think this information might be that would shed more light on, on her work at Bletchley? Is there a smoking gun, as it were, you think you could get hold of? Does it exist, or it's just a case of piecing together information as you find it?
Well, it's possible that Fujitsu still have some of this information. So BTM became ICL, and then ICL were bought by Fujitsu, I think, in the 1990s. And I know that they do have an archive. And in fact, I spoke to Martin Campbell Kelly about this, and he had looked at their archive, but they haven't been overly welcoming. And also, with the pandemic and everything, it's made it very difficult to see any archive material. But it's possible that there's something at Fujitsu. But, potentially they may just think, what's all this thing, ancient junk, and bin it.
Yeah. So
it's hard to know.
So it's the same industrial history. We've got an observation, a question for another one from Naomi, came near the start when I think you were discussing Dora's family's reason for settling in England rather than on Ireland when they came back from India. And she pointed out Ireland had what did you say here? Ireland still has a number of excellent schools. And the reason for settling in England might have been other reasons. Whether there could have been other factors for going to England rather than going to Ireland if you take schools out of the equation?
Well, I honestly do think it was to do with schools, and it may be. So there were three children. Dora was the eldest, and then there was Howard, and then there was the deaf sister Hilary. Now, I know that Dora's cousin, Nora, her favourite cousin, the one that was married to a member of the Barton family, had been to Bedford High School. So it may just have been something simple like, that member of the family saying Bedford's a great school, and also it's got great schools for boys and girls. And it may have had something to do with with Hilary, because I know that their mum visited, I think it was called the Deaf Mute Institute in Dublin or something like that. And she was horrified by it because they equated deafness with stupidity, and were very, very kind of old-fashioned in their approach. And she ended up hiring a couple of governesses for Hilary, who not only taught her to speak, but then gave her a kind of ordinary education as well. And in fact, Hilary ended up being a comptometer operator and working for Dora. So I think it's probably a combination of factors, partly family recommendation, partly the needs of the three different children. But again, I'm speculating. It's impossible to know for sure.
And I suppose I've got a follow-up question. You pointed out she was pretty well connected. I mean, she hung out, I can't remember the name of the society you referenced when she came back. I mean, Lady Astor was a member of it, and various other large and influential names of the time. Any possibility we can conjecture that might have helped open, as these things always do, even in today, it might have helped open doors into government contracts for her? Absolutely.
I mean, I think she'd always been working with various government departments, right from 1919 onwards, and she was moving in those kind of elite circles in Ireland and in England. And I don't think her joining the Women's Provisional Club was, just for fun. I think it was very much about their business contacts. And from her diary, I've got that she went to a party at Lady Astor's in, I think, 1940. I can't remember the exact date. She was a good networker, and she was always, right from the very beginning, at the highest sort of social level in terms of, particularly in terms of politics. I mean, Sir George Clarke in Belfast, ended up being a Northern Ireland senator, and he was clearly an old friend of the family that she happily stayed with when she moved over there. So she kind of landed at that level, even though, as I say, the family weren't particularly well off or posh or anything else. They just seemed to. I think, particularly in Ireland, if you were Anglo-Irish, you were just part of that set, and everybody seemed to know everybody, in that group.
Well, she certainly was a smooth mover to hang out with people like Joe McGrath on one hand and Orange Men on the other, and then Lady Astor on the other. I mean, how does someone manage to do that and keep your head straight? I don't know how you managed to do that and not give yourself away. Naomi's just asked again, did she have did she have a connection to Winston Churchill? Did she go that high? Do we know?
I don't know. I don't have any record of that. I mean, Nancy Astor was a bit of a strange character as well. I mean, she was American for starters, but also she had some pretty extreme views. She was pretty racist, and she was anti-Semitic and all sorts of things. She was not a straightforward character. But this is again where Dora's ability to kind of take a neutral stance and keep her mouth shut, and just focus on her own goals, perhaps, was an advantage. So she didn't seem to take offence at people's political views. She just saw what she needed from them, really.
And I suppose I don't want to take up too much of your time. It's coming up on time, but we talked a lot about the people. But did she have any sense of the competition, the IT services competition out there? I mean, IBM as it became was out there. CTRB, I think it was by the early 1900s. Had she seen what was going on over on the other side of the pond? Did that inspire her, or was she totally divorced from that? This was happening in her own world, and was she aware of competing companies outside of BTM? How much did that kind of come into her thought? Do we know?
Well, I mean, BTM and IBM were very much connected. I mean, the tabulators that BTM were building were IBM designs. That whole collaboration started right from the very beginning, from when Everard Green went over to the States in 1903, and learnt everything he could from the Tabulating Machine Company, which then later became IBM. And it was only post-war, I think it was 1949, that the relationship between BTM and IBM came to an end, and they went their separate ways. And this was part of a wider government policy to develop a big British competitor to IBM, because up until that point, IBM had basically said, well, we'll have the American market, and BTM can have Britain and the Empire, which was basically the rest of the world. And then I think IBM realised that they were missing out rather on a lot of markets there, and so post-war, they became competitors rather than collaborators. So I mean, she would have always been aware of that international competition, but I say I don't think she was interested in hardware. She was interested in what these things could do, and developing that side of the business. And I think I don't know whether she was conscious that was a kind of a gap in the market, if you like, or whether she just kept going and just kept doing a lot of business and just didn't even find that there was any competition, really. Certainly not until post-war.
Just pointing out 9 point. IBM provided, IBM and the Holocaust. If you've ever read the book, IBM provided not just the machines, but also the punch cards to Nazi Germany through neutral countries, Spain during the Second World War, and then they the whole wreath machines. It's a great read. Great. Well, I'm going to leave it there. I think my last question for you is, what's next in terms of writing? Do we expect you're obviously carrying on with the research? Do you plan on there's the blog there? Are you planning a website, a proper book at some point? How far have you got with the project?
Yeah, so I have written a book about her, and I've ended up writing it as a novel because there were too many sentences that would have started perhaps because of the gaps in the documentary evidence, which would make it difficult to write as a biography. And anyway, I mean, I think it's an inherently dramatic story. And also, I think, Dora as a person was a very quiet and person, and would not have told this story. She took this story to her grave. And so I've had to write the novel with her as a character rather than perhaps the person that she actually was. And I've written a couple of drafts, and I put it out to an editor earlier this year, and I've got that back, but I just haven't had time to rework it a little bit. But I will be looking for a publisher in a couple of months' time to try and get this out there, because I really want her to take her place in history. And I really want to thank you guys actually for allowing me to talk about her this evening, because that is part of my mission, is to get her to take her place. And I really appreciate the opportunity to talk to you about it.
And thank you very much. Mary's just popped in the URL into chat. If you want to check out the website, www.dorapower.co.uk, please go over there and check it out. It's an amazing presentation. I'm looking forward to hearing more about Dora's incredible story.
Thank you. Thank you so much.